When replacing bearings on the Sequence proprietary TEFC motors, it's critical to acquire all necessary tools to ensure quality work. Consult your MDM representative to procure all the custom jigs required for pulling and replacing motor bearings.
Alright, now that we've popped out the rotor from the motor itself, we want to do a bearing replacement since both these bearings are bad. So we do want to pull these out, and with a bearing puller, several different sizes and makes you could have. Just want to balance the center of the puller onto that shaft. Start pumping it up to where those legs start to bite down on that bearing. And just slightly pull it up off that shaft. Once you get loose enough, you can just pull it off by hand. That's removing the front bearing. Just want to flip the rotor around to where we can pull off the back bearing. May be easier to get a little spacer, like a socket, kind of fit it over the back end of the rotor there. And we could just make sure everything's level. Let's continue on to pull off the back bearing. Now that we pulled off both bearings, we want to clean the rotor off where the bearings sit. And you do that with some acetone or some lacquer thinner. And again, you just want to clean where the bearing sits in place and any other part of the rotor that might have some grease residue or just, pretty dirty. And once we get it fairly cleaned off, we are ready to install new bearings. Now that we've got the old bearings pulled off and we've cleaned the rotor, we can slide on the new bearings just to where we can press them on enough to where they stay in place. And with our hydraulic press here, we can install them. So we have our Sequence 1000, our bottom jig. That allows us to rest the rotor in, as well as the Sequence 1000 top jig. It's a little too high, so I can take off this one of these plates. And we just want to make sure we align everything straight to where the bearings will press on evenly. And we can start cranking down. Once you start to get in contact with the jig itself, just going to want to slow down again. Make sure everything is pressing on evenly. Just keep an eye on everything. And basically just want to keep on pressing down until you get a little resistance, and that's kind of telling you where you're bottomed out at. Don't want to press much further than that. Go ahead and release it. Remove the rotor from the jigs. Just spin the bearings, make sure they spin freely. Everything's pressed on evenly, and that's the installation of the bearings on a new rotor. Alright, now that we've installed new bearings onto the rotor itself, it's time to assemble the rotor back into the motor. So we want to install the front end bell back on over the front bearing. Just press that in all the way, make sure it bottoms out. And you can even get a little mallet or something to tap around on the edges. Once you know that's in all the ways where you'll see the bearing meets up flat with that end bell. Alright, now that we've got the front end bell back on and we've tightened the two clamps that keep the bearing attached to the front end bell.
You point to them from what the camera can see.
You can see the one clamp here as well as the other clamp on this other side. And this is for the Marathon motor. All motors are slightly different, but that's a similar concept. So now the rotor's ready to be installed back into the casing of the motor. And you want to make sure you get this wave spring. Once you usually take out the rotor from the beginning, this rotor will have a tendency to fall out. So you just want to make sure you get this back in place, and you just want to rest it inside the back end bell hub.
There's a wave spring, it just needs to sit in that hub right there.
And now we're ready to press in the rotor again. And on all end bells, there's a little indentation. That little mark represents, this is the bottom of the front end bell. So you want to make sure this portion is pressed in at the bottom of the motor. Just want to gently slide that in. Kind of tilt the motor up a little bit so it does press in all the way through. Now we just want to align the bolt holes, the long bolt holes that connect the entire motor back together. And it's a little tricky, so you may need to just play with it a little bit. And this bolt hole is actually going to connect to the front end bell as well.